Hello and welcome back to the Sekimeiya Spun Glass. Commentary is now live again, my voice is recording, and we'll go straight back in. And the last time we fell asleep while talking with Shiraya because we had about 50 minutes to kill where nothing was supposed to be happening. That being said, falling asleep normally is something that, lasts for longer than 50 minutes, so we'll see what happens. Amidst all my fantastic thoughts, my consciousness had given up. It felt like no time had passed, but I knew better, as sometimes that meant I'd been asleep for a full day. It wasn't easy to move. When I tried to stand up, I saw that Shiraya had fallen asleep on the other bed. I sat up, aware that since nobody had come for us, not much time could have passed. I didn't want to wake her, but also I wouldn't leave her behind to go explore, so I simply waited as that brought no downsides. My head was very cloudy and my muscles let me know that I hadn't chosen a good position to sleep in. With how tired I was though, I barely paid mind to that. My movements had a delayed effect on Shiraya, so I didn't have to wait very long. She woke up seconds after I'd started to lie against the wall. With her eyes almost closed, she turned to face me. It wasn't a new sight, as I'd seen her woozy morning face a few times in the previous days. Sorry, I fell asleep. How long has it been? I don't know, I slept too. Since nobody has come for us yet, probably not that long. I see. Instead of sitting up, she plummeted back down. Sleeping for such a short time used to make me feel even more tired, but since there was no guarantee I could continue, I forced myself to resist. It was clear that we needed to sleep for much longer, but we were still in a very uncertain situation around someone who'd murdered the same person twice. Seeing it that way, it was scary to think we'd fallen asleep, because once our 50 minutes ran out, we'd be completely defenseless. Technically, nothing prevented anyone in the other bedroom from entering ours as soon as Shiraya left the hallway. I was sure that Shiraya felt it too, probably more strongly than I did. A creeping fear that we could be killed at any moment, forced deep down inside of us by the rapid pace of developments inside the tower. It was a testament to her resilience that she hadn't outwardly broken down, and I didn't know how I was managing it. A couple of minutes later, Shiraya had rolled in bed a few times until she'd come to the realization that she wasn't going to easily fall asleep again. Being more aware of the risks might have prevented her from doing so that time, so she shortly sat up and breathed slowly while rubbing her eyes. After a final yawn, she decided to speak. Well, what do we do now? Oh, what do we do? If we look through the door, we should be able to know if we used up our time or not. Alright, let's see if anyone is still there. I had to balance myself after standing up. My body didn't react well to the abrupt change. After I was steady, Shiraya grabbed her purse and we went down the ladder. I gripped the handle and peeked through the small gap that let me see the hallway. Is the other bedroom still closed? Yes, but we also closed it when all of us went to the crystal floor. Oh, so how do we figure out if anyone's inside? Maybe the footprints could tell us. We walked carefully through the hallway. Having no sense of time was a very strange feeling, but everything around us was fully silent. If people were still in the other bedroom, the door was perfectly hiding their presence. Once we got to the living room, we identified a slight change. Did we leave it like this? We'd been used to looking at the footprints in front of the door, but that was no longer possible. The door was closed and the movement of it had erased every single footprint nearby, creating an empty arc. We must have. This means that the group already left though. Even though the motion of the door had erased the nearby marks, there were many around the entire room. They were much fainter than the last time I'd seen them, but I was still able to recognize that new ones existed. I glanced at the elevator. Its door had not yet been closed. We'll need to go down then. We traveled from the cleaning room right after we got to the crystal floor, so it'll be fine. Yeah, let's see if something happened. I figured the others must be searching for us. I opened the door, retracing its arc, and we began going down the stairs after I left it open. The next door was closed too, but it was unlocked. We stepped onto the 6th floor and were met by less comforting scenery. It was a strong reminder of recent events. We didn't have the will to check every partition, so we walked around the floor at a slower speed than normal, still getting our rhythm back. We hadn't used the elevator, but there was no real point to that. As we headed down, our echoing footsteps were all that we could hear. The silent path ended at the final staircase. Even though logically we should have heard people, we were only met with more silence. There should be people here. Let's go to the cleaning room. Right, maybe the Sekimeiya is still there. I'm also curious about what else was in the cart. We walked up to the door, which hadn't been fully closed. As soon as we opened it, we instantly noticed the drastic change the room had undergone. What the fuck? The cleaning cart that had previously been there was nowhere to be seen. I recalled that it had been in a corner of the small room. Aside from its disappearance, I didn't think anything else had changed. Did someone take it with the Sekimeiya inside? No, I don't think so. No? Of course, that should have been my first thought, but there was an inconsistency. I had looked at the cleaning cart a few times before. Underneath and around it there had been 3 buckets storing scurries and chemicals like bleach. Those hadn't moved. They're not, stuck though. You can move them out of the way and then move them back. These 3 buckets, one was under the cart, right? I think so. They must have put it under it because there's not a lot more space here, but if you try to move the cart, you'd hit it and the other 2. First they'd need to be taken out, and then the cart could move. Oh yeah, I guess so. I can't say for sure that nobody moved them, but if they had, it would be really odd for them to put them back in the exact same spots. I suppose. Nobody would get the cart out anyway. This means that the cart disappeared too, right? And only the cart, not the buckets under it. In other words, what you were touching. This also means that we're past the time we traveled from. Are you serious? That can't be it, since when you traveled for the first time you were touching the cabinet. How come it didn't disappear? That's true. I supported my body on it with my left hand, so I was touching the cabinet. That's strange. If this cart disappeared when we traveled, did it appear somewhere else? Shireya leaned forward with a frown. She was looking inside the buckets. Wait, it's here. Look, inside this one. Adopting a similar frown, I walked ahead to see what was inside. I saw it immediately. The Sekimeiya. It was inside the bucket that had been under the cart, on top of a pack of sponges. It was white, indicating that it had powered on already. Why is it here now? I believe this actually makes sense. Maybe you're right. If our travel made the cleaning cart disappear, the Sekimeiya being inside it would have fallen in here. But why is it still here? Did nobody enter this room? They must not have. Well, what do we do with it? I thought for a few seconds. We'd lived a portion of our recent past from up to 3 different perspectives. There was no need to immediately touch it again unless we needed to figure out what had happened after we traveled. Let me do what Sai did earlier to avoid traveling. We should investigate before we think about activating it. Okay. I hid my hand under my sleeve and kneeled to grab the Sekimeiya. I touched it with my shirt and nothing around me changed. As I stood back up while holding it, I noticed something was wrong. Wait, it's not hot at all. Earlier when Sai did this, the Sekimeiya felt really hot for him. He even touched me with his sleeve. Now though, it's actually cold. So it won't do anything right now? I wanted to test it, and I got close to Shireya so that if it worked, the range would encompass her too. Perhaps it was a bad idea since nothing assured us we'd appear together, but it was better to try it like that. Without overthinking it, I placed my entire left hand on top of the Sekimeiya, and nothing happened. After a full second, nothing had happened. Yep, it doesn't work. That's strange. Can you think of why? Not at all. At least not if it stays consistent with the previous events. If the mechanics are completely random, it can just be that it takes a random amount of time until it starts to get hot. However, minutes after the Sekimeiya that Sai had in his pack turned white, it was already really hot. I don't get it then. It's very confusing, yeah. You know, a lot of strange things are happening, that's become very clear. Someone around us is a culprit that's behind this whole thing. We've put it in its main cabinet a few times, but they keep getting it out. We last saw the cabinet key in the attic, but we won't go back up just to see if it's still there. We should try to understand how it works. I think working on that is better than just putting it back where it came from. So, what do you want to do? This time, let's be the ones to hide it. Later, we'll be able to see if anything has changed and hopefully understand better how it functions. We have a chance since for some reason nobody appears to be here. Are you sure? The cameras are still recording and we've repeated a few times that every place where we can hide it is somewhere someone will eventually look at. Regarding the cameras, I'm not sure we should worry. The culprit has been recorded plenty of times and will be able to justify our actions if that ever becomes necessary. When it comes to hiding spots, I can think of a couple. The times we were trying to find the Sekimeiya, we only really looked through this floor, but I believe every spot in the attic would also be easy to find. The partitions, one of the desk drawers. So I have two suggestions. One is inside a computer tower. Okay. I saw screwdrivers in the attic. If we open up a computer tower and hide the Sekimeiya inside it, it's hard to think anyone will easily find it. It requires thinking about it and unscrewing every other tower up until you find it. That would be a bit of a hassle for us though, so here's my better option. A locker. Alright. I thought of it earlier. The last key in Naomi's keyring. It's likely it belonged to her locker, given that every staff member has one, and the size of the key seemed appropriate for it. Wouldn't Kate have recognized it? Yes, just like how he should have recognized the attics. We can try it. I'd thought that maybe Shiria would be more hesitant and I'd been ready to abandon the idea, but she didn't oppose it. Given the purpose was to further understand the Sekimeiya, it was likely she was also hopelessly thinking about using it to rewrite our recent days. With such a thought in mind, it was the first time we felt the countdown ticking along. The exit was presumably going to be unlocked in fewer than 8 hours, and we still had to look at what time it was. We only had those hours to understand what the rules were, and if they'd ever be useful to us. However, the voice recorder kept haunting us. We'd found something that implied we'd be there for a whole month. It was funny that, for the first time, that sounded very slightly desirable, as it would have given us more time to comprehend what was going on and how to use the Sekimeiya. Someone could have wanted to trap us for a month just to accomplish that, but I couldn't begin to imagine how the rest of the plan would unfold in that case. At the same time, the exit was going to open at some point, and the Sekimeiya would be exposed to the world. Supposedly, it had been found 2 weeks prior in a nearby mountain. It was hard to believe nobody had experienced its supernatural powers, but as I thought that, I recalled that I was also holding it in my hands without a single effect resulting from it. We entered B4, the room with the first Naomi. I remembered where the keys were, so I found them easily. 2 keys remained. The small one I wanted, and the one for the door in the first staircase. I took the smaller one off the keyring. Otherwise it was too large to keep on my person and it might have made noise. Then we walked to the staff room. I inserted the key into a locker. I'd once again been correct about the purpose of a key. I'm pretty sure it'll work. It's not for this locker, so let me find the right one. I inserted the key into another locker and attempted to turn it to no avail. Then I repeated the process with others until one opened. Good, it's this one. I opened the big door. 2 compartments were inside, a small and empty one on the top and the bigger main one that had Naomi's coat hung inside it. I placed the Sekimeiya in the smaller one and took the coat out. I felt through the pockets, but they were all empty aside from a single handkerchief that I left alone. You do know that if you place the Sekimeiya in the top part, people will be able to see it through these slits at the top of the locker, whereas if you'd put it at the bottom, no one would be able to see it. Bad idea, Atsuki. I put the coat back inside. It was a bit disappointing that we hadn't found anything substantial, but I hadn't expected to. I closed the door and locked it with the key while Shiria observed all my actions from the side. That's it then. At least there are no security cameras here, so we won't be seen hiding it. I know. That's good. By the way, regarding the card disappearing, I think it makes more sense than not. What's really strange is that nobody seemed to have noticed the fallen Sekimeiya. For example, when I touched the Sekimeiya, why did I teleport but not the cabinet? And why did my clothes teleport? I was stepping on my shoes, so they teleported. My shoes were stepping on the floor though, so why didn't the floor teleport? It's probably just because my clothes were under my possession while the floor wasn't. Similarly, the cabinet I was touching wasn't under my possession, but the card was under yours. That's very interesting, as the card is designed to be moved by whoever is holding it while the cabinets aren't. That's why the simple act of touching the card makes it be under your possession, but touching a cabinet or the floor isn't enough. That's About what I imagined, but it means that somehow the Sekimeiya recognized that the card was movable and the cabinet wasn't. Exactly, which is convenient for us, or else we could have made many more things disappear just because we were making contact with them. Remember the suitcase in the attic? Something similar must have happened. Naomi traveled holding it, so it traveled along too. We didn't find it strange at all, since it's natural to imagine it would happen, but your purse has traveled both times when it was only touching your clothes. It has to be because it's recognized as being part of your whole entity when you travel. But we didn't appear upstairs with the cart while I had my purse. Right. If the cart actually appeared somewhere else, that would indicate again that the location where we appear isn't determined by where we are when we touch the Sekimeiya, or else it would have appeared with us. So, if the cart has appeared somewhere, that position must have been determined by where the cart was at another point in time, and it should be easy to draw conclusions from that because it spent the entire time in the cleaning room. I think so. Finally, consider this as well. When the cart traveled, everything that formed the cleaning cart disappeared alongside it. That included the bag covering its interior and the cleaning products that were placed at the front of it. All of that disappeared as it was considered a single element you were holding. That's why it's notable that the Sekimeiya didn't disappear while it was also part of the cart. It was inside it, so it should have been part of what you were touching with your other hand. However, it remained in place and fell in the bucket that was underneath it, which didn't teleport as it wasn't attached to the cart. So, as we thought, the Sekimeiya can't go along with us. Pretty much. Even though it's what allows you to travel in the first place, it should have been part in what was determined as your possession. That wasn't necessarily the case in the previous travels. I wasn't holding the cabinets in the same sense. The Sekimeiya must exclude itself when it comes to what it makes travel. And lastly, even if it had traveled, it's unlikely we would have appeared with it, which is what I speculated could have happened with the Sekimeiya inside hip pack. Since the cart didn't appear with us in the attic, the Sekimeiya probably wouldn't have either. I guess you're right. This clears a few things up. We should probably try to get an idea of what happened here though. Yeah, the others should still be around. I'd imagine they looked at the place we disappeared from, so I have no idea why the Sekimeiya was still there. Let's go find them. We'd been moving through hallway B for a few minutes, so it seemed appropriate to begin there. It was unlikely anyone had been near us, but we weren't going to lose much time by making sure to glance at every room. The start was the two bathrooms, and aside from Naomi's body, they were empty. Then, in a rapid manner, we began to open every door to see if anything we could easily spot was around. The Sekimeiya cabinet, as expected, was empty. The original Naomi was still partially under a curtain after I'd grabbed her key, so I covered her properly again. The last crystal rooms were as they'd been from the start. To go to the opposite hallway, we went to the lobby, knowing that the mechanical room was also on our way. Unexpectedly, our search came to an abrupt stop when we stepped into the large hall. People were next to the metallic shutter. We recognized them immediately. Erina, Akaro, and Kate were kneeling down next to the wall while Sai looked at them from above. As soon as we opened the door, their heads lifted to meet our gazes. After a couple quiet seconds, Kate was first to further acknowledge our presence and stood up from the floor. He began walking toward us, and we did the same until we met in the middle of the room. "Where were you? What the hell happened earlier?" While the conversation started, we walked to the others who had kept silent. Strangely, they were looking down again, wearing unsettling expressions. "You mean when Sai snuck away?" "Right, we disappeared. The Sekimeiya made us go to the past again, and this time we appeared in the attic." "Oh, I see." After a strangely short response, we went over to the shutter. Something might have happened, as everyone else appeared quiet and unresponsive. I wondered why they decided to stay there too. Well, you mentioned a couple of people earlier, Aski. There was one particular person missing. Isla. "Did you search for us at all?" Since that wasn't a question directed at anyone in particular, Sai decided to speak. "You were in the attic, you said. Why didn't you come down sooner?" "We fell asleep and lost track of time. Did something happen?" "Where's Isla?" I asked that instinctively, but I hadn't consciously realized that Isla wasn't with them. I have. Erina, who I'd imagined would quickly answer, remained looking down at her lap, hiding her face from us. A strain filled my body as that mere action made me imagine that something very bad could have happened. None of the others decided to respond either, and instead shut their eyes before lowering their heads. Finally, I noticed that their expressions were tinged with sorrow. They understood that their own reactions had started to fill us in. After a few unsettling seconds, Sai began speaking in a faint voice, uncharacteristic of the way he'd come across at any other time. Shira and I, along with the others who lay against the wall, listened to the words that narrated what had taken place while we'd been sleeping 6 floors above. At the same time that Shiria and Atsuki disappeared from the cleaning room, Erina and Isla, who were in the opposite hallway, saw Sai appearing from hallway C. As soon as they made eye contact, Sai's body visibly relaxed. As if he'd changed personalities in an instant, he began slowly walking toward the 2 girls next to the event room who hadn't said anything yet. Without a care in the world, he was first to ask a question. "What's going on? Where did the others go?" "What? They went to find you since you disappeared all of a sudden. Why did you do that?" Naturally, Erina didn't know how to react, given the others had made it seem essential to guard hallway A in case Sai went there before they could get him. "What do you mean? We were gonna start searching for the Sekimeiya, so I just went ahead first." "What? Why didn't you tell us then? Didn't you go to hallway B?" "Yes, but I headed over here since it's a better place to start with. I was gonna tell you two to come, but you were looking at me weird, so I wasn't sure if anything had happened." Those weren't very convincing words, but Erina didn't question him further, mostly because Sai's own question cut in. "Where are the others?" Peeking inside the event room with a frown, Sai noticed the lack of other people. "They went behind you, didn't I say it? They're in hallway B." The door to the opposite hallway was open and Akuro could be seen with his own frown, evidently ignoring the sound of their conversation. Sai said Akuro's name out loud, and a few seconds later his head finally turned to face them. Upon asking him what had caused that strange face of his, he let them know that Shira and Atsuki had not yet left the cleaning room. Sai, showing the strongest reaction, approached the room while letting out a conspicuous thinking sound. A thinking sound? Okay. He opened the door and stayed still for some time. Then he entered the small space. Before the others had time to wonder what he was doing, he exited and told them that it was empty. Akuro, who had a hard time believing it, stepped forward and became aware of the glaring contradiction within the room. Seeing his dumbfounded face, Erina and Isla got closer too. The 4 of them saw that not only had Shira and Atsuki vanished from the room, but that the cleaning cart had too. A disappearing cart was nothing compared to everything that had already happened. Once the other 3 stepped in, they became aware of the cause. The Sekimeiya sat inside one of the few buckets that had remained on the floor of the little room. It was Sai who first questioned its status, as it somewhat contradicted a few things they'd concluded earlier. It was white, instead of the grey color they thought it would become after having teleported 2 people and a whole cleaning cart. Not much discussion was had. Up until then, they'd grown accustomed to Kate's voice immediately instructing them to put the Sekimeiya back in its cabinet. It was the lack of those words that alerted them that Kate wasn't there. "Where is Kate?" "He followed you to hallway C." "Me? Then why didn't he come to the event room when we were in hallway A?" Doubtful looks were the only answers. Sai, Erina and Isla had spent a few seconds talking next to its door. Of course Kate should have been seen. Taking advantage of Kate's absence, they removed their full focus from the Sekimeiya and left it where they'd found it, prioritizing finding him. All of them assumed that attempting to find Shira and Atsuki was futile, as they'd most likely teleported through time and were somewhere else entirely. Sai was first to suggest going to see where Kate had gone, which shouldn't have taken a long time. With Akuro in the front and Sai in the back, the 4 left the room and saw the empty hallway C. The stairs presented the possibility of Kate having gone upward, but hallway A was the most likely option. Shira and Atsuki should still be here even if they traveled back in time. It could be that Kate took advantage of the situation to do something. Sai called out Kate's name, while Akuro viewed the entire situation with suspicion. As he'd seen Sai in front of the cleaning room where the Sekimeiya had turned out to be, he asked Sai why he'd disappeared earlier, which was answered the same way he justified his actions to Erina. They stopped in front of the stairs and Sai sighed as soon as he saw the other long empty hallway. "You all rushed too quickly to find me when I was only trying to move things along, and now this happened. We found the Sekimeiya already at least, but now we have to search for 3 people, which is just great." Sai began directing the others. With Atsuki and Kate gone, his demands met no resistance. His arrangement consisted of Erina and Isla staying next to the stairs and Akro checking hallway B, while he himself looked through the hallway A rooms. That way the search wouldn't take more than 2 minutes. As they put that into practice, Sai continued yelling out Kate's name. He wasn't being drawn to the noise, so it followed that he wasn't nearby. Drawing a zigzag pattern, Akro and Sai met in the lobby after looking through every room in their respective hallways. In the meantime, Isla observed next to her mother. Despite her initial optimism, she was aware of what the situation had become. Sai put an end to the search by deeming the mechanical room empty. They walked back to the starting point where Erina and Isla waited. Once the 4 of them knew that they were the only people on that floor, they wondered where Kate had gone off to. With a free way to the other floors, he could have been anywhere, and even though they'd quickly accepted that Shira and Atsuki had once again travelled through time, they should have shown up by that point. Atsuki's and Shira's actions weren't openly questioned. After all, everyone had assumed they'd found the Sekimeiya and had touched it without negative intentions. After Akro had revealed that Sai had been about to enter the cleaning room, Erina couldn't help but suspect that they were being shamelessly manipulated. She sat on the stairs. She was tired and had to bear the constant thought of having brought her daughter into danger. They were locked up in a huge building with a murderer, and the people she wanted to trust had accepted that time travel was an ongoing factor they'd used to explain the mysteries pressing down on them. Mentally, she was exhausted. Ever since the first time they had found Naomi's body, she had been especially careful not to let Isla out of her sight or go off with anyone else. She simply couldn't fully trust him. From finding Naomi's second body onward, it was irrefutable that something unnatural was happening, but her only priority was her daughter's safety. Isla had initially been eager to go to what was supposed to be a routine event, but it had turned into something incomprehensible. Erina couldn't imagine that someone would want to harm her, but the risk of being there at all gradually eroded any confidence she had in that notion. She only wanted to show that she needed a short break before the search that seemed to follow. Her own daughter didn't grasp that intention as she suddenly walked off toward hallway A while the others stared at her curiously. "Sweetie, where are you going?" With a distressed and concerned voice, Erina let out those words, looking up from the stairs. Isla turned around and saw her mother's face, which she found a little hard to decipher. Choosing to answer the question with her own actions, she continued walking and stopped next to room A5. It was the place where gemstones had been stolen, the sole crystal room exposed to the smoke. Isla reached up to grab the doorknob and turned it to open her way in. From the stairs, 3 people looked at her, finding what they were seeing very odd. As soon as they saw Isla entering the room, Erina gave up on her brief rest and stood up. While she approached the room, she timidly called Isla's name. When she was by the door, the 2 men behind started to approach her, intrigued by Isla's behavior, but she was gone. Isla had left the door open, so Erina was first to see the inside of the room. As she remembered, it was dirtied by a dark color, and very little light went through the coating on the ceiling. The light leaking in from hallway C was the main source of illumination. It took her a second to spot Isla amidst the obscurity. She was putting all of the force she could into opening up a cabinet. Unbeknownst to Erina, what would then occur would not leave her memories until they all faded away. Applying force with her 2 small arms, Isla lifted up the heavy cover of the cabinet, found deep in the room. To prevent it from closing, she leaned on a wall. After that, she attempted to peek inside, but her short body didn't make it easy. With both hands, she grabbed the top of the cabinet and propelled herself upward to see inside it. Once her eyes made contact with what lay within the compartment she'd uncovered, a nightmarish scream tore through the room, terrifying Erina while she looked in from the hallway. But that was only half of what she had to witness. Isla's face was hidden in the cabinet, so Erina was unable to see that her confident look had shifted into an agonizing expression. Erina's mind reeled in response, and as she began running to aid her daughter, she wondered what the cause of such a horrible scream could have been. Had it been physical pain, or a reaction to something she'd seen? Which is going to be the dead body of her friend. As Erina rushed inside, Isla's instincts told her to get out of the position she'd put herself in. However, due to her jump, the front of the cabinet had suspended her in mid-air, painfully pressing into her stomach and not letting her legs reach the floor. The only way she could move was by leaning forward. Next to the door, Erina's senses all perceived the same thing. Isla, in her helpless state, inclined forward and fell inside the cabinet. Only the sound of her body was heard as no yell came out. Like the curtain falling after a play, the impact made the lid fall, shaken out of its precarious balance. Erina let out a cry and ran as fast as she could. Meanwhile, Sai and Akro looked on from the door. When Erina reopened the lid and leaned in, she finally saw what the ominous cabinet contained. Nothing. Yep. Erina didn't see anything but the 5 faces of the cabinet covered by a velvet texture that, while untainted by the smoke, appeared black due to the lack of light. She stood still while her heart sped up. Then she snapped and began to feel its walls, trying to understand how that cabinet had swallowed up her daughter. Unable to find anything, she desperately looked around the cabinet in case she'd misinterpreted what had happened. Akro and Sai, however, both bewildered, had arrived just in time to corroborate that Isla's lower body had fallen inside. They stepped in while Erina's next reaction was to open up the adjacent cabinets in hope of a hidden connection. Within all of them, the only contents were a handful of gems. As that wordless commotion continued, Sai moved toward the cabinet Isla had fallen into. He looked inside it for a few seconds and verified with his own eyes that there was nobody inside. Just as Erina had done, he couldn't suppress the need to reach in, attempting to find a hidden passageway. He felt the entire interior, and once he was done, he stood back up to gesture at Akro that Erina was right. There was nothing there. They turned to Erina, who had gone completely immobile. Every cabinet had been opened and closed, and she was leaning against the last one without the strength to look up. Before the others had to wait, she spoke with a nearly broken voice. "Where did she go? She couldn't have disappeared." In their circumstances, that normally sensible claim had no basis. Of course she could have disappeared, as such a thing had already happened multiple times. The real question they had to ask themselves was how. Sai and Akro knew that, but they didn't reply, unable to find appropriate words. "Tell me, something must have happened to her, and it has to do with this. Teleportation you two keep talking about. What happened?" They had realized that the room was empty. Isla had suddenly disappeared without leaving a trace. Even though disappearances had become commonplace, they'd thought that the Sekimeiya had to be directly involved for one to occur. Despite that, they'd found it in the cleaning room and left it there. Furthermore, Atsuki's earlier explanation of the range emitted by the Sekimeiya couldn't explain what had occurred, as nobody else nearby had disappeared along with Isla. And even though it seemed of less importance, there was one last thing without an explanation. Isla's scream. She let out a terrifying cry as soon as she looked inside the cabinet. However, Erina had immediately looked inside and seen nothing. Sai and Akro told all of that to Erina, who until that point hadn't fully considered the full implications of the paranormal events she had witnessed. They wanted to reassure Erina that even though Isla had somehow disappeared, she had gone to the past and was safe somewhere else. Erina knew that what had happened couldn't be immediately answered, so she rushed out to find Isla, hoping they would reunite soon. They had a whole building to search through and no guarantee that Isla was still in it. At the same time, a part of Erina was still trying to understand why Isla had suddenly walked to that cabinet. She tried to comfort herself when she remembered the recording they'd heard in the attic, since, in the worst case scenario, it told her that Isla was going to be safe in a month. For the first time, Erina viewed it as a failsafe instead of one of the worst possibilities. Only 3 people were part of the group that still remained on the crystal floor. They wanted to urgently find Isla, whose vanishing had suddenly generated the first real instance of chaos since the start of their imprisonment. They confirmed that the Sekimeiya hadn't moved from the cleaning room, and their rushed search began. They kept yelling Isla's name, hoping that she would appear before them. Even though a single disappearance hadn't yet been linked to direct danger, Erina was very clearly nervous, which was why they went through the whole building as fast as they could. Having recently looked through the entire bottom floor, they were done with it swiftly. The elevator should have still been disabled in the attic, so their search continued through the stairs. Emitting clear desperation, they hastily looked through the rest of the building, yelling for Isla. Once they finished, the result took a bit of time to sink in. Not only had they not found Isla, but Kate, Shirei and Atsuki hadn't been drawn to their yells either. As they thought, the elevator was still open and they chose not to re-enable it yet. With a much slower pace and devoid of energy, they headed downstairs, surrounded by the haunting silence. Erina's thoughts kept going back to the recording, which she could no longer make Sai and Akira listen to, even if she wanted to, as it had disappeared along with Isla's purse. The crystal floor was just as empty as before. None of them knew what to do, so they lethargically walked to the lobby. Before them was the immutable shutter, preventing them from escaping and obtaining help. Erina leaned against it while the other two stayed still. Imagining how much Erina was suffering, being faced with the precarious disappearance of her child, they had chosen long ago not to say anything unnecessary. For a while they stayed there, powerless against the confusing reality, hoping that waiting would lead them somewhere. They knew where the Sekimeiya was, but without Kate, dealing with it seemed far from their priority. It appeared impossible that it had been related to Isla's disappearance, but no other explanation existed. Out of the blue, they found themselves alone in a huge building with 2 identical corpses after 4 people had vanished. The silence had not been interrupted since they set foot on the crystal floor, but the 3 of them had been thinking about drastically different things. It was an outside sound that finally breached the empty air, coming from hallway A. They immediately lifted their heads. The door had been left open, so they all rushed to see if they could spot the origin of the sound. They did so easily. Kate's figure was in the middle of the wide floor. His shoulders slumped. As soon as they saw each other, Kate rushed to them. "Where did you go? We searched for you." Sai shot the first question, and an immediate answer came that left the 3 of them unsatisfied.
I don't know. I think I experienced what Atsuki said, that teleportation. I've been searching for you.
That brief explanation was all they got, as the next thing that came out of his mouth was the question they'd known would come.
Where are Isla, Atsuki, and Shira?
Kate looked through the door and saw the empty hall. 3 faces lowered in front of him, communicating what had occurred. Akira, knowing how hard it was for Erina to hear those words, chose to speak and briefly explain the recent events. It was a lot of information to take in for Kate, and it only made everything that had recently happened even more confusing. Despite that, he had a few thoughts that he chose to keep to himself.
I see. I'm sorry, but I have no clue what happened to any of us. You said you searched the building, right?
The others nodded. They told him where Isla, Atsuki, and Shirya had disappeared from, so he began walking to where they'd last seen Isla, as that part of the story was what he least understood. They all entered room A5 and were hit by the memory of Isla's body falling into that looming void. They lowered every lid before leaving, so Sai pointed at the specific one. Kate approached it, finding it hard to believe that nothing had been found inside. He completely denied the thought of any opening or passage within the cabinet, so he wanted to see if he could get a good idea of what had happened, or if he could reinforce what he believed had truly occurred. He gripped the lower part of the lid with his right arm and lifted it. As soon as the smallest gap appeared, he peeked inside. Even though there was very little light, he frowned. As he continued uncovering the cabinet, that frown shifted into a much darker expression. Once he was done, he could only gesture at the others to see with their own eyes, as he couldn't bring himself to say the words out loud. Hearing his faint but trembling voice, Erina rushed to see what he'd seen. When she saw the body of her daughter lying face up, her mind broke, and all of her thoughts were defied. Isla almost looked like she was sleeping, but the lack of her chest rising made Erina fear the worst. Without thinking, she reached inside, and as soon as she felt Isla's skin, she gave out and collapsed onto the cabinet, creating a sight reminiscent of the last time Isla had been seen. She had felt no trace of life, only a cold piece of flesh with a texture far from the one she recognized as her daughter's. While the others stared with pity, Erina didn't move, sharp cries piercing the air. The recording which she had begun to see as proof of hope had become an impossibility. After some time, Kate looked inside the cabinet again while everyone kept an eye on him. He didn't see anything else. Isla rested alone in the space she'd disappeared from. The others knew how heartless it was to attempt to solve what had happened right away, but nobody could help but think about how little sense it all made. Isla had disappeared from an empty cabinet to reappear inside it later, The only change, her status from alive to dead. A third death had surfaced, and that time someone who'd been with the group from the start had been the victim. Once again, a number of questions came along with it, but no answers, not even the cause of death. Regardless, the unfortunate reality was that a mother had lost her child on what should have been an enjoyable day that had morphed into an inexplicable nightmare. The rest of them verified that Isla was no longer alive, and while they were hit hard by such a tragedy, they knew they couldn't begin to imagine what Erina was feeling. They exchanged looks without interfering with her body trembling as she hid her face. Eventually she stood up abruptly and dashed out of the room, briefly displaying her tormented expression. Erina had left due to her recollection of Naomi's death. A killer was nearby and had managed to remain unseen. Even though she couldn't begin to take in what had happened, she understood that her life had warped into something terrible, regret her only companion. She took advantage of the last amount of strength she had within herself and used it while adrenaline still let her. Frantically, she opened every door of the hallway. Then she looked through every cabinet in case the killer had brazenly hidden in one. Her thoughts on the matter were clear, and she knew who to suspect. Pate, Atsuki, and Shiria could have been responsible in some way. However, as soon as she entered the huge and overwhelming lobby, her body gave out under the full weight of her daughter's death. She wouldn't be able to find her killer, and most likely, she would never begin to understand what had happened to her. Suffering from the most painful feeling of emptiness, she slumped on a wall and slowly slid to the ground. Sai, Akro, and Kate, upon noticing that the sound of Erina's movements had abruptly faded, walked to the lobby and saw her sitting on the floor ahead. They approached her slowly and remained at her side. A loud noise resounded through the entire floor, and they understood what it had been. The cabinet's lid had fallen when nobody had been looking, sealing Isla inside while also letting her rest peacefully. Nobody chose to leave the lobby. They knew that gravity, a simple law of the universe, had closed Isla's coffin by itself. However, they didn't know the true consequences that sound had brought, and spent the time unaware until the hallway B door opened.